NATO leaders are getting down to work in Washington today for their 75th anniversary summit. The big focus this week will be on getting more military support for Ukraine. And speaking Tuesday, host Joe Biden announced a new air defense system for Kyiv. The president's speech came amid doubts over his political survival after that disastrous presidential debate with Donald Trump, the former president known for loudly questioning NATO's relevance. Siobhan Silk has more.
Facing questions at home over his ability to lead, on Tuesday, US President Joe Biden was on the world stage. As the US hosts NATO's 75th anniversary summit, the White House is keen to shore up confidence in Biden's leadership skills, not just for US voters, but for US allies. Speaking in full voice, Biden began his welcome speech with a history lesson.
Together, we rebuilt Europe from the ruins of war.
And continued with promises for the future.
That we're ready, that we're willing, we're able to deter aggression and defend every inch of NATO territory across every domain.
And he had a concrete announcement of new military aid for Ukraine in the form of dozens of air defense systems from several NATO allies. Desperately needed resources as Ukrainian forces struggle with troop and equipment shortages while Russia continues its relentless bombardment despite reports of its own shortages.
Ukraine can and will stop Putin, especially with our full collective support. And they have our full support.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is looking for more. At a pre-summit event on Tuesday, he spoke of Ukraine's need for not just defensive, but offensive capability.
We can significantly limit Russian actions in southern Ukraine and push the occupier out of there if American leadership assists us with the necessary deep strike capabilities.
And though NATO's vow of support has been consistent, it's still stopping short of promising the membership sought by Zelensky. But some NATO diplomats are proposing that the summit declaration should cite an irreversible path to Ukraine's membership.
We're going to talk more about this now with transatlantic strategy and security expert Garret Martin, who joins me live from Washington. Thanks for joining us. The NATO summit opened last night with Biden, who's been overshadowed, of course, by all the controversy over his age post-debate. Do you think the NATO member nations got that strong U.S. leadership they were hoping for?
I think the speech was a first step. I think there's going to be great scrutiny in the next few days as to how Joe Biden acts, whether he seemed up to the task. You can imagine that there was already great trepidation even before the disastrous debate because Joe Biden seemed to be behind in the polls. So I think the stakes are certainly very high, and there's going to be a lot of expectation on the part of member states as to how well Joe Biden can lead.
He was trying, of course, to project an image of a man who can be president fully for the next 4 years. Do you think that's what the NATO leaders saw, a man who's able to do that?
Well, I think they saw that he could do very well on a scripted speech. I think we've seen that in recent weeks. I think what we haven't necessarily seen is how can he react on impromptu situations, and how will he do, for instance, in the press conference on Thursday, where there will be, again, sort of high scrutiny. The question also is to what degree will his own difficulties overshadow the achievements that NATO is trying to project to the outside world this week.
Right. And I think for many Americans, it will be hard for them to unsee what they saw at that debate last month. I mean, as you say, there's going to be this live press conference that's going to be a big test for the president. But when it comes to NATO, Trump and Biden are in such opposite camps. You know, of course, Trump thinks the U.S. should just retreat into its own borders, doesn't need NATO. What kind of effect would a second Trump presidency have on NATO if it were to come to that?
I mean, it potentially could have a disastrous effect. I mean, we had 4 years when Trump was president, and at the very least, we could say these were very difficult. They were full of public disputes and full of projections of disunity. We do have alleged reports that Trump would seriously contemplate a withdrawal, a full American withdrawal. And you can imagine that would jeopardize the longevity and the future of NATO. So, yes, there's certainly NATO is on the ballot box. Is on the ballot in 2024 in the presidential election.
What about the effect a Trump presidency would have on Ukraine, which is such a key issue, particularly at this summit?
I think, again, we can have certainly significant question marks about the American commitment to Ukraine. I think it's already in a context where there is division. I mean, we saw the delay for the supplemental aid in Congress only a few months ago. Trump's statements have certainly not been very encouraging, and he has suggested that he could go and essentially negotiate an end to the conflict in 24 hours. So the risk that Trump might essentially abandon Ukraine is certainly not completely far-fetched.
Washington last hosted a NATO summit in 1999 for the alliance's 50th anniversary. How have things changed the most in the 25 years since then?
Well, they've changed in so many different ways. I think in 1999, yes, there was the war in Kosovo at the time, but the general security environment was a lot more stable. Here, we're in a situation where NATO, of course, has a major war in Ukraine, has some challenges in the south, but also very much has to deal with the rise of China. NATO is also now has 32 members as opposed to 19. So the challenges of managing the alliance and maintaining cohesion here are also significantly amplified.
What about Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO? Could that get one step closer to reality?
Well, we're still very much at the stage where formal invitation is not on the table. I think what we're going to see is essentially a semantics battle over the final statement. I think there are some reports that we may have a little step forward from last year where the timeline was very vague. I think there are reports that the statement might talk about at least it being on an irreversible path, which would at the very least, claim or suggest a firmer support. As to an exact timeline, I still think that's very unclear at this stage.
There's another turning point for NATO. In some ways, it's getting a new Secretary General. That's the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, who'll be stepping in October. How will he compare to the current NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg?
Well, I think, first of all, I think Jens Stoltenberg has done an outstanding job managing the alliance through an extremely difficult time. And I think also, to his credit, Stoltenberg managed Donald Trump very well as well. I think Rutte was partly chosen because when he was Dutch Prime Minister, he had also been able to stand up and manage Donald Trump quite effectively. He's a well-known operative and leader amongst his fellows or member states. So I think for that reason, I think he will certainly be entrusted.
All right, Garret, thank you for taking the time to speak to us. Garret Martin there.
My pleasure. Thank you.